Well, it was in 1982 that Judge Harold Green issued a decision which led to the breakup of the AT&T Corporation. And that's our topic this week on the Communicators. The impact of that decision 30 years later on telecommunications. Joining us in a roundtable discussion is Professor Roger Noll of Stanford, as well as Professor Jerry Hausman of MIT. Both of these gentlemen were involved at various levels in the breakup or the decision to break up AT&T. Joining us here in our Washington studio is Paul Barbagallo of Bloomberg BNA. Professor Noll, if you could start, first of all, what was your role or what was your activity during the breakup of AT&T and what led to that decision?
Well, the roots of the antitrust case were in a presidential task force that was formed during the Johnson administration in the late 1960s called the Telecommunications Policy Task Force. It had concluded that the telecommunications industry, at least the part of it that was in the federal jurisdiction, could be competitive, and made recommendations both to mainly to the Federal Communications Commission about how to cause that to happen. Then when the Nixon administration came along, the holdover staff in the antitrust division, after watching for a couple of years, decided to pursue antitrust rather than FCC regulation as the means to introduce competition. My role was that I was on both the Telecommunications Policy Task Force and I was one of the outside economists advising the Department of Justice during the mid-'70s when the case was actually being shaped.
And Professor Hausman.
Well, I didn't come in to the proceeding until actually right around 1982. And thereafter, when the antitrust division decided to review, it was about 3 years later, the effect of the breakup, there was a report that was done, and I was an advisor to the government on the report, and then was involved thereafter in the various changes and modifications to that consent decree of Harold Green. A number of times I put in reports and testimony before Judge Green.
Professor Hausman, were you supportive of the decision?
Well, at the time, I would say medium. I'd say looking back, I'm quite supportive, but it was based on an incorrect theory. And in my view, and I've written academic papers, it probably cost consumers somewhere between $50 and $100 billion in payments that they should not have had to pay. Because the consent decree was based on the wrong theory. And actually, although I quite like Judge Green, I once even had dinner with him in London, I really doubt that a federal judge, no matter how well-intentioned, could really do a good job here. He was definitely in over his head. You know, he was not a telecommunications expert. But on the other hand, I've always thought that the Federal Communications Commission probably wouldn't have gotten it done and done as well as it's turned out. So in that respect, yes, looking back, I think things have worked out well, although the path there was a bit rocky.
And Professor Noll, were you a supporter at the time, and what do you think 30 years later?
Well, I definitely was a supporter of the antitrust case. I agree with Jerry that some of the details that Judge Green imposed on the agreement, on the settlement, had no real basis in either technology or economics. But on the other hand, I guess my standard isn't as high in the sense that when either a judge or a regulatory commission makes a generally pro-competitive decision, that's good news because that's better than what they normally do. And so I believe that divestiture was an important event, one of many that have caused the American telecommunications system really to be the envy of the world, to have its performance is the best in the world, and the reason it's the most competitive.
Paul Barbagallo.
Professor Noll, you had mentioned that there were some errors that Judge Green made. What were some of those errors?
Well, the premise that Judge Green believed something that AT&T argued prior to AT&T's change of heart to go along with the divestiture, which was that the weak sister of the old Bell system was the local operating companies. And so in the divestiture, there are, it's sort of silly at this time to go into the details because most of them are irrelevant today. But what he did, whenever there was a close call, the divestiture decision was something in favor of the local operating companies and against the interests of the long distance and equipment manufacturing part of AT&T. And that was fundamentally a mistake because the premise of the case, as it was developed and litigated, was that it was the interstate part, long-distance telecommunications and manufacturing, that could be competitive, and it was the local part that was a secure monopoly, primarily because of the role of state regulation and an old Supreme Court decision which said the federal government couldn't assert jurisdiction over local regulation. And so that I agree with Jerry that the premise that Judge Green entered, that somehow it was a local service that needed to be protected, was completely false.
And there's actually another problem as well, which I'd like to say, and this shows what happens in court proceedings. The government brought the case against AT&T, if I remember correctly, in 1976. And as I've pointed out in some of my academic papers, two things happened in 1976 which fundamentally changed the technology and was going to doom the Bell system as it was at the time. That was computer switches, digital computer switches first came in 1976, and very much faster transmission equipment came in 1976. So that was going to fundamentally change the industry, but because that's when the case was brought, until 1995 when Congress got rid of Judge Green did things based on that technology because that was a record of the case. And in telecommunications, where things are changing so fast, and I brought my prop for today, my cell phone, which has fundamentally changed the world, he did his best, but he really couldn't take into account the changing technology because he didn't have the record evidence to do it. So that was yet another problem. So I'm certainly agreeing with Roger, with respect to the local companies. But what I really saw the main problem was the changing technology. And for instance, France, at the beginning of the 90s had a very good internet-based system, and the United States didn't really get that until 5 to 10 years later because of the restrictions built into the consent decree. So it certainly had its pluses and minuses, but I think Roger and I agree it's all worked out to the best now.
And how has the breakup of AT&T affected the world we live in today? Certainly, we have what some would say a duopoly in network access, that is to say, the big broadband pipe business. So quite a lot has changed since then. So, gentlemen, how had that breakup affected the market today?
Well, I think that you really have to look at the technology. Remember, at the time of the breakup, AT&T was the largest corporation in the world. That AT&T is gone. I mean, there's a company called AT&T, but it's the old Southwest Bell operating company
and
that
Bell South,
bought out
right?
and Bell South that bought out AT&T. So what happened? Well, it's sort of what Roger pointed to. No other country beside the United States, when they privatized and allowed competition in telecommunications, broke off the long distance company, because as of 1976, when you had the computers coming in, the old 5-level Bell system was not going to exist in the future. So the long distance companies are gone. MCI is but a faint memory, and the old AT&T is gone as well. So what has changed? Well, there was a huge mistake made at the time of the breakup. McKinsey, which is much in the news the last few days, but is a well-known consulting company, at the time of the breakup, AT&T had to make a decision. Should we keep our cellular spectrum, which the FCC had given us, or should we let the box have it? So they asked McKinsey, and McKinsey predicted that as of the year 2000, there'd be 1 million users in the United States of cellular telephones. It was a pretty good prediction, except it was off by 99 million. There were actually about 100 million cellular subscribers in the year 2000. And so that's fundamentally changed the world. And AT&T, although they invented cell phones at Bell Labs, basically gave up the ghost by letting go of cellular. So that's what I see, is long distance ceased to be a business, separate business, and you have cell phones. I would disagree with the lack of competition. I mean, there are always people in Washington arguing everything. That's how they stay in business. But if you actually look, the latest government statistics are 32% of the people don't even have landline telephones anymore. They use cell phones. And of people who have landline telephones, about 30% of them now have cable telephone. So there's competition out there. And in terms of the internet, 4G is coming in, and there are various predictions about what's going to happen to internet capability. I'd be willing to predict in 10 or 15 years the majority of use of the internet is going to be over mobile phones and cell phones throughout the world. So one really has to understand what technology. Excuse me?
If you expand that to wireless devices, so you don't limit it to cell phones, we're almost
that's
there
what I mean
already.
that's what I mean by that's what I mean by mobile and cell. It's just tablets, you name it. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I think the really important point about your question is that the mindset of the world well into the mid-1990s was that wireline access with stuff either on poles or buried in the ground was the key to understanding competition in telecommunications. The intriguing part of the wireless story is how very few people inside the industry, that's why the McKinsey report came out the way it did, was that it wasn't just Judge Green and the FCC who did not understand the potential of wireless. It was the entire industry, except for a few visionaries who were sort of regarded as kooks. And so what turned out to be the case was that the hope that some people had that you could have a robustly competitive fixed line access industry, where a half a dozen companies are offering you telephone service over wire, either cables or copper wire pairs like the telephone company, that vision was mistaken. But wireless is really the future of access. And if we can solve the spectrum problem, the spectrum scarcity problem, which the FCC is right now trying to solve, then the almost everything that historically we thought of as being the domain of wires and cables is actually going to be provided over the air. And that industry is robustly competitive. And so, did the AT&T antitrust case have anything to do with this? It had something to do with it, but as I say, its relevance today is not as great as it would have been had the original vision of everybody getting telecommunication services through things on telephone poles and buried in the ground. Had that been right, there would have been a more important case.
And as you mentioned,
I'd like to make 2 points, if I could, along those lines. The first is, I completely agree with Roger. And when the Telecom Act was passed by Congress in 96, I think it was, the FCC set up regulations to try to bring this type of competition in, although by that time I think you could see that cellular was going to be very important. And somewhere probably in the hundreds of millions of dollars, probably much more than that, probably in the tens of billions of dollars, was invested in what was called the CLEC business, the competitive wireline business. And that just completely failed. When the tech bust came in 2000, those companies dropped like flies, and the investment basically turned out to be worthless. So, not only did a lot of people in the industry not see it, a lot of people were investing hundreds of millions or billions of dollars, and they didn't see it coming either. But I would like to actually bring up one thing that I don't think that the old AT&T gets enough credit for, and this actually worries me. If you go back to the cell phone or the tablets or whatever, I see there are 3 enabling technologies for those, and they really have changed the world. The first was a transistor. Where was the transistor developed? Bell Labs. The second was cellular telephone. Where was cellular telephone innovated? Bell Labs. And then arguably the third is a radio technology that's used, which is essentially CDMA. And I'll give a small plug to MIT. That was originally begun to be developed here for military uses. And then Professor Jacobs, who was a professor who moved to San Diego, started Qualcomm, and that's the technology used throughout the world. And what I see as a worry is most U.S. industry does not want to do fundamental research. We do have government labs, but I would say charitably they're less than a success in terms of innovation. And so big innovations like transistors and cell phones, only come very long time period. So it's hard to make predictions. But I don't think we ever do want to lose sight of many of the enabling technologies. Pretty much everything you use today, came from transistors in terms of electronics, and it's completely changed the world. And so are we going to get innovations like that in the future? Well, things remain to be seen.
And gentlemen, you mentioned wireless, the importance of wireless over the last 20 years, and a third of U.S. families have cut the cord. And last year, as both of you know, we heard lots of references to Ma Bell as AT&T proposed to acquire T-Mobile. Many had said that Humpty Dumpty was being put back together again. Now we know that the DOJ moved to block that deal. So my question to you both is, how many competitors do we need in the market to ensure the public interest?
That's a really tough question because it's always specific to the circumstances of the market that you're studying. And it's particularly hard in telecommunications because the technology changes so rapidly. But the standard answer that most economists would give you is that somewhere around 5 firms that are robustly on the fringe of the technology, who are efficient and innovative, is the number that is sort of the number that would guarantee you a competitive outcome. And indeed, most of the U.S., nearly all of the U.S., has that many wireless carriers. So I'm not particularly worried. I think the main issue about the reliance on competition in wireless to keep us all happy and innovative is the spectrum issue. That the government still sits on an enormous quantity of spectrum that is either underutilized or not utilized at all. And sometime over the next few years, we have to break that loose and create substantially more spectrum that's available to the private sector for use in wireless telephony and telecommunications. I think that will happen, although every time one makes a step, one finds resistance. And so, I think the single most important policy issue for us in the next few years is to make certain that the spectrum available for wireless telecommunication is adequate to support the growth of the industry that consumers and the firms are going to want to take us to.
So I think that the spectrum issue is of foremost importance. And I think there was a huge innovation made in around 1994. Myself and some other economists recommended to Congress and the FCC that they start to auction spectrum rather than giving it away. So one might remember, if you go back and read various books, that the Johnson family, since Roger brought up Lyndon Johnson, Lady Bird Johnson was given all sorts of radio stations. Her husband, of course, was powerful in Congress, and that led to their family fortune. And even in as late as the 90s, during the Clinton administration, a special deal was given to the Washington Post to get much cheaper spectrum than other people. So the government has always found it difficult to run this as a market. And now you have all sorts of government agencies or government bodies that have huge debt problems. Local governments are really having difficulty meeting their budgets. And they're sitting on enormous amounts of spectrum. And if they switched from analog technology, which is the generation-old technology, to digital technology, they could share that technology with private users like mobile phones and tablets and all, and everyone would be better off. That's what economists want to see. But as Roger said, every time we get close, politics seems to enter the fray again. So I'm hopeful, but certainly can't guarantee that this problem is going to get solved.
Jerry Hausman,
I think we do have to be patient, though. Because remember that the idea of a spectrum auction was came about from Ronald Coase in the 1950s. It took us only 40 years to get there.
Roger Noll is currently at Stanford University. He is the director of the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research. Jerry Hausman is an economics professor at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. We are talking about the 30th anniversary of the decision to break up AT&T. Gentlemen, we'll start with you, Professor Hausman. What's the relationship between the 1982 decision by Harold Green, and is there a relationship between that and the 1996 Telecommunications Act?
Yes. By 1996, it was well recognized that things had gotten out of hand, and the technology had changed. And so in 1996, a deal was made in large part, and that was if competition was introduced and became sufficient, then a lot of the restrictions of the consent decree would be eliminated, like long distance. But even by 1996, I actually made a prediction in 1996 that within 10 years, the old AT&T would be gone. It turned out I was off by 1 week. It took 10 years and 1 week for the old AT&T to be gone. So it was certainly an improvement, and it had its heart in the right place, the Telecom Act. But again, it was somewhat behind technology. As I said, the regulations were set to favor the new entrants. The new entrants came in, they invested a lot of money, they all failed, and now it's just completely irrelevant. So 15 years later or 17 years later, it's pretty much completely irrelevant. But that's due to the march of technology more than anything else, at least in my view.
Professor Noll?
Well, I basically agree with the assessment. At the time the act was passed, I thought it was ridiculously complex. It was not a good piece of legislation. If we complain about poor Judge Green with his lack of sophistication and some of the decisions he made in divestiture, well, I'll take Judge Green over Congress any day. The act is really not very well crafted. But nonetheless, the beauty of telecommunications is nobody has, not the FCC, not the Congress, not the courts, has ever made a bad enough decision to stop the march of technology and the places that it's taking us. And so retrospectively, the 1996 Act, its single most negative feature was that it caused an enormous amount of resources to be devoted to regulatory strategy as the means to gain a competitive advantage in the industry. It was not sufficiently deregulatory enough and not sufficiently pro-competitive enough. But because wireless technology in particular quickly mooted it, it's not doing any significant amount of damage now.
So is it possible to regulate telecommunications, and if so, should it be done?
Well, I think that it's certainly possible to regulate it. We have 100 years of proof that it's possible to regulate it. The problem is that competition, if it's feasible, is always a preferred strategy to regulation. Regulation makes enormous sense if technology has dealt you a hand that says this industry is not going to be competitive, that you can't hope to have more than one or two firms in it, and those firms, given the nature of the market in which they're operating, are going to have enormous market power, and they can not only extract a lot of money from their customers, but they can control technology in nefarious ways that are mainly for their own self-interest, as opposed to letting the technology blossom to its maximum feasible extent. So regulation is something to be done when the market conditions require it, but to be done reluctantly and to be done with as much restraint as is consistent with the policy objective. I think the main criticism all of us who've studied this industry over time is that even when the FCC was allowing competition to increase, was hiving off components of the industry in which it was allowing competition, the process was way too slow. It could have been accelerated much more rapidly. It could have been much more efficiently handled than it was. Now, that, of course, the best is always the enemy of the good, and I still believe that given where we are today, obviously not all decisions were bad. It's just that it took longer than it should have taken, and we should have in mind the notion that given what technology is today, the industry can provide enhanced telecommunication services in a competitive market. And when that's true, there is relatively little need for regulatory supervision of what goes on in the industry. So as I said, several years ago, at this point, I think except for managing the spectrum and running spectrum auctions, the FCCs should be basically abolished. I see no functional use for it today.
Paul Barbagallo, last question.
So
I'd like to answer that as well.
Go ahead.
So I would agree with Roger. I think the FCC should declare victory and, apart from the spectrum, exit the field, because we are very competitive. But I would say the only group of people I can see who would be helped by re-regulation are the segment of Washington lawyers and lobbyists who deal in regulation, and that's just rent extraction. So we've won. Competition has won. Roger and I have both always been in favor of that, as most economists are. So I think it would be absolutely absurd to think of re-regulation.
And in 10 words or less, Professor Hausman, who's the biggest benefactor of the breakup of AT&T?
Consumers. Every time when I see my students walking around campus, I always think, since they always have cell phones and they're either listening to music or talking, I talk, therefore I am. And so anybody who picks up a cell phone any moment of the day and uses it to access the internet, listen to Pandora, listen to music, call people anywhere in the world, use Skype, etc., and I mean tablets as well, they're the people, consumers, who have really benefited the most. And of course, that's what competition is supposed to do.
And Roger Noll?
And well, I agree with Jerry that the consumers are the main beneficiaries, but you also have to add in the firms that didn't exist 10 to 15 years ago that are now among the leading corporations in the world. That is to say, people who provide the software and internet-based services that are only made possible by high-speed digital technology, Google, Facebook, whatever. Those also are the big beneficiaries.
Roger Noll at Stanford, Jerry Hausman at MIT, and Paul Barbagallo of Bloomberg. Gentlemen, thank you all very much.